Hello and welcome to TA Made Simple, a episode of this, a weekly episode where Bob Cook describes key aspects of transactional analysis and makes it simple for everyone to understand. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at the different schools. We're going to start with the classical school, sometimes known as the Burnian school. That was the very beginning of transactional analysis, Bob.
Quite right. So over the next 5 modules, if you like, we're going to do the first module in this audio clip. We're going to start at the beginning. Good start. That's a good place to start, I think. The beginning.
Yes. I think there's a song in there, Bob, somewhere. Yes.
So Eric Berne, who was, the originator of transactional analysis, which I've been talking about, and his personality model, parent, adult, child, and earlier videos, he developed his personality model, which he called transactional analysis, parent, adult, child, 58, 50, 59, 60, and he wrote his seminal book, TA in Psychotherapy, in 1960. So that's the beginning of transactional analysis as a psychotherapy model. That's the beginnings. And he surrounded himself then with people who took TA further. And that period till he died in 1970, a decade later, that evolution of the early TA was really known as the classical era and was known as a classical approach. Now, some books would call these early pioneers coming from a Burnian approach. So interchangeably, the Burnian approach, or as it's the first approach, if you like, of TA, it could be called the classical approach. So that's what I want to talk about, the early ideas of the early pioneers of the evolution of transactional analysis psychotherapy today, really.
Yes, and I know that we talked before, and Berne kind of, so the fable says, he was denied access to the New York Psychoanalytical Society, I think, after training psychoanalysis, and he went off to develop his own ideas, and they were an amalgam of ideas from his time in the military and time working in hospitals, because he was a doctor and he was a psychiatrist, and he developed this model, which I think you refer to as the structural model, which is parent, adult, and child. Yes,
correct. That's absolutely right. So that became the hallmark of his model, with the 3 other pillars that I've talked about: transactional analysis proper in an earlier video, games, and script. That became known in its entirety as a transaction analysis, if you like.
Yes.
And then the next bit is how do clinicians then, what style do they follow? So, for example, do they follow a psychedelic approach where the past affects the present? Do they delve more in a person's past? Do they actually stay in the here and now? Now Berne's real focus with the classical school was strengthening what he called the adult ego state up. And that's the part of the ego of all of us which stays in the here and now. So I'm 68. So basically how I think, feel, behave as a 68-year-old, not as a 3-year-old boy.
No.
Or not as a person who's, been framed by his parent and acts out as this sort of, archaic historical figures. But that I'm in the here and now, not influenced by the past or these present, past figures.
Yes.
His focus with the classical school was strengthening the adult ego state up and encouraging people to know when they're in the here and now, and also know when they aren't coming from the here and now, basically. So there's more spontaneous, they've got a sense of more flexibility, they've got more sense of spontaneity because they're actually here in the here and now. And he also believed in cognitive behavioral techniques to enable that, just like we do now, if you like, in CBT. where we think of keeping people in the here and now, and giving them coping mechanisms and techniques to stay in the here and now. And he believed that was the quickest way for people to be cured, if you like.
Yes, and when we've talked about this very early model, the beginnings of it, there's two things that really strike me. One is that he said, and I think he wrote in one of his earlier books, that you'd have to go to, as he called it, this is his words, the blackboard, to write diagrams and to show people. I suppose it was long before they had interactive or white clean boards. They would have been made of black, and people would use chalk. And the other thing that I found fascinating was that he was a very, very early exponent of the idea of therapeutic contracts. The idea that you started with the problem, you work through that, and once that was sorted out, that was the contract done.
Yeah, and you go on to another one.
Yeah.
That's right. And the quicker, the better.
Yeah.
So he really did believe in speedy cure.
Yeah, which is an interesting. It's a real step away from the roots of the psychodynamic therapists who may be seeing people 3 times a week for years and years and years. Think about Woody Allen, for instance, is a classic example. He's been in therapy virtually all his adult life by the news reports.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really interesting because Eric Berne, I think, was a genius, and at the same time, he was fairly contradictory. And, some people would argue, especially reading some of his biographies, that his creation of transactional analysis was in direct response to his rejection of psychoanalysis, because he moved away from psychoanalysis, if you like, and wanted a much quicker cure in the here and now, instead of spending, as you've just talked about with Woody Allen, spending 10, 15 years in analysis, looking at the first 3 or 4 years of your unconscious life or conscious life. And he wanted to move away from that. And so the new social workers in the 60s in America, 70s, really liked this, because they had these, what you just said, these behavioral techniques, going to the board, being able to put parent, adult, child on, looking at egograms, and being able to really aim at cure quickly.
Yes. And I think one of the things that really separates Berne from Freud is Freud was very big on drive theory, biological drives and sexual drives and libido, where Berne really didn't make reference to that at all. It seems to be more about the emotional place you find yourself in. There was no kind of reference to biological drives or sexual frustrations.
It is interesting, Roy, as his theories developed. It's really interesting what we're talking about here, and what in this classical area of the classical techniques and concepts, what was concentrated and what wasn't concentrated on. Because he did talk about what he called hungers, which is the nearest concept to drives. So you have the hunger for recognition,
right?
You have a hunger for structure. So he did talk about these hungers. However, in this period, and the people surrounding himself, Steiner and Ernst and Cartman, they didn't really concentrate, I don't think, on these hungers and the search for structure. They concentrated more on how people can stay in their adult, and how they can analyze repetitive behaviors and get out of them as quick as possible. Staying in the here and now.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting to know that he used the language of hungers as a way of talking about compulsions.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Very much so. And of course, he did talk about in 1961 the idea of the developmental idea of TA, to do with the history of the child informs the present. And he did talk about internalized parents, which influenced. But he really, really had a focus on helping a person sorting out what he called contaminations, what was influencing the person from the past and the internalized parents, so they could stay in the here and now. And that's what he would call cure.
Mm.
And because if they're in the here and now, they've got more access to options, flexibility, and spontaneity.
Absolutely. And I think you can't separate him either from, the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist. He was in America. It was the 1960s. The language of America was changing. The social structure of America was changing. And I've often heard the term in terms of, the big difference between classic psychoanalysis and all the other therapies that followed was European pessimism and American optimism.
Yeah, I think you're right. And of course, he was very much in the vogue of the humanistic movement. So, if you think of Rogers just around the corner and the concept of self-actualization, because his positive psychology about I'm okay, you're okay, being the premise for health, of course.
Yes.
Right in the framework of the human potential movement.
Yes, of course. Of who Maslow, Rogers, and Aldous Huxley were all exponents of. They founded the human potential movement.
Byrne really was in that rank.
Yeah.
The idea of, I just said, the OK Corral.
Yes.
And really, he believed, of course, that if you could stay in the here and now, increase flexibility and options, that not only is cure, but the human personality was able to, if we're going to use Roger's words here,
yes,
actualize themselves.
Yes,
that they had the innate human potential to move to an I'm okay, you're okay position.
Yes, it's fascinating. When we've often talked about this, sometimes off camera, but when you dig to the roots of most of the therapies, there's so much overlap. It's fascinating, isn't it? The adult ego state could almost certainly be the organism itself, and the drivers and injunctions could be conditions of worth interjected values.
You're absolutely, and I think you've hit it on the head. I think you've hit something really important here, and that is the context of the time.
Yes,
because we're coming out of I won't say out of the psychoanalytical area, but there's a lot of questioning about drives and some of the unconscious phenomena of Freud and Jung and people like that.
Yeah,
and the development of the the humanistic movement.
Yes,
coming along in the 50s and 60s, and where America was, and I think that's a really important point you've made there.
Yeah.
And Byrne was right in the forefront of that. He was right in the forefront of the humanistic movement, and his really big ideas about I'm okay, you're okay, and the potential of the human.
Yes.
To take the opportunity for that. So that this era, this time, it was called the classical approach because the therapists in the early 1960s employed the classical ideas, games, script, transactional analysis, proper, and ego states, which Byrne created, of course. So these therapists were called either Byrnian therapists or Byrnian therapists operating from these classical theories, with the focus being strengthening the adult ego state.
Well, that's a really, really well-rounded overview of the beginnings of transactional analysis, because it's not a story that ends with Byrne's death in 1970.
No,
it goes on. And in the next episode, we're going to be looking at the next school which developed, and that was called the...
we've got the Redecision School.
The Redecision School.
Very few months apart, two schools came along competing with the classical school, and that was the Redecision School by Bob and Mary Goulding.
Yes.
And the Cathexis School by Jackie Schiff.
Yes. And we're going to be looking in the next episode at the Redecision School.
Yeah. We're going to We're going to look at the redecision one, and then the third one will be the shifting school.
Yeah. So stay tuned. If you've got any favorites or any kind of preference to the different schools, you're a TA therapist, you may be watching this. Why don't you put you put it in the comments bar below, because it kind of blows TA wide open. I know if it's taught as a comparative model in universities and colleges, it's never taught in any great depth. I know I have to hold my hands up. I never taught it in any great depth. So if you are on a person-centered course and you have to do a comparison, this is just super information for you. And of course, you can reference these. So as always, Bob Cook, I look forward to seeing you in the next video, as long as you don't decide not to do it. You see what I did there, Bob?
I'm deciding to do it, Rory, so okay.
Right, okay. That's a decision then.
We're both okay.